Well, good morning. Oh, gosh, man. Happy Daylight Savings Day, right? Goodness. How many of you forgot to set your clocks and missed? Anybody? All right. Yes, Charlie. Of course, it's the old guy. Never mind. Just kidding. Well, hey, we're in this series. I love Charles. We're in a series called Red Letter Invitations from Jesus to You. If you're new with us, I'm Jim. I'm the lead pastor here. And the reason why it's called Red Letter Invitations is because we see through, many of our Bibles have the words of Jesus in red. And there's just so many different invitations that Jesus gives us in the Gospels that were recorded. And so we're going to be covering a number of them in our time together. And I want to start off this morning. I'm just curious, how many of you just really loved climbing trees when you were a kid? How many of you were tree climbers? How many of you were tree huggers? Because you were tree huggers because you couldn't reach the branches to climb the tree, right? That was me for a long time. It's like I watching everybody else climb, but I couldn't. I was a tree hugger. I wanted to, but I couldn't reach the branches, right? But how many just love climbing trees? And the challenge was with climbing trees is many times, your parents or grandparents didn't want you to climb the tree, right? And so while you're climbing up in the tree, they would come running out there and say, "Get down out of that tree right now," right? Because you're going to get hurt, right? But you just kept climbing, right? Now, let me ask you this. How many of you ever went tree riding? Come on now, anybody know what tree riding? Anybody know what tree riding is? I did not know this until one year in high school. I think it was my senior year in high school. One of the kids I was hanging out with, probably wasn't the best influence, was hanging out with him. He said, "Hey, you want to go tree riding?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" So you go out in the woods and you find the skinniest trees, the young trees, right? And you climb up them like you're climbing up a pole. And you get up so far, and you know what they do? They start bending, and you ride them all the way down, right? And so we just do that. We work our way through the woods going, I know, it doesn't sound very exciting. You're like, "That's stupid," right? That was me. I was stupid, right? But we did that, and he thought it was all great. But then one day, guess what? The tree broke. And guess what else broke? He broke his arm. Never went tree riding again. Well, today we're going to be talking about a guy who liked to climb trees, evidently. Today we're going to be calling their topic, the invitation is from Jesus to come down out of the tree. And today we're going to be talking about a guy that was one of my favorite people to learn about in Sunday school as a kid growing up, because there was a song that we sang about this guy, and it's not politically correct, and you probably couldn't sing it in Sunday school today without somebody complaining, but this is a song about a guy who was a wee little man. You know what I'm talking about? All right, we're talking about the story of Zacchaeus, right? And how many of you remember the song, right? Let's sing it together. I'm going to get tired of singing this on the worship team one of these days, But it's like, okay, it goes, "Zacchaeus was a wee little man." See, that's not politically correct. "Man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. One day the Savior came that way and looked up in the tree and said, 'Zacchaeus, come down right now, for I'm going to your house today.'" All right, so you guys are good, right? All right. You guys remember the song. See, I remember that all the way back when I was just a little thing, right? Song about Zacchaeus, who was this wee little man, Now, what's interesting is we're going to go in and dive into the story of Zacchaeus is being a wee little man just kind of creates a lot of challenges. What was common for Jewish people during this time is they would often take on the trade of their family. And so I'm sure Zacchaeus, he probably is thinking, you know what, I don't want to grow up and be a zoo midget or a circus midget, right? So I'm going to do something different. No, there was no such thing as circus midgets back then probably. But he's like, whatever it was, he didn't want to follow the family trade. And he decided he was going to go off on his own because he struggled being a wee little man. Now, I remember years ago, I struggled being a wee little person because I was short for so long. And I forgot to tell you I was going to move around. And one of my biggest things, it was the hardest things to deal with as a kid, is when you would go to an amusement park. And you remember when you go to an amusement park, there'd be something like this, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? How many of you went to Kings Island when it first opened up years ago, right? Years ago. See, I went to Coney Island. It was in Cincinnati when it was first, for the flood in 72. I went to Coney Island, but then I went to Kings Island. And you get to Kings Island, and they'd have these little people standing there at the entrance. So you'd wait like 40 minutes in line to finally get to the entrance, right? Where the gates were, whatever it is you're walking in to get red light, and you're all excited because you're there with all your friends and you get the ride. But the problem was you get up there, it's like, you must be as tall as Pigtail Patty in order to ride this ride. And the problem was I was never tall enough, right? So the next time it's like, I'm wearing platform shoes. You remember those? Those were in the 70s. You might say, I'm wearing my platform shoes. And I was still too short to get on the ride. And from that moment on, I hated girls with pigtails. Just kidding. Just kidding. But I was like, it was just so demoralizing, right? Because you want to get on the ride and you can't get on the ride because you're not tall enough. And so there's something that takes place inside of us when we don't measure up, right? And I just remember glimpses of that as a kid. It's like, so excited, but man, that just hurt. And then it just kind of transfers over to so many other areas in our life. And this is what's going on. I'm going to move this over here out of my way. You guys can enjoy my artwork. That's what I do all week. I don't prep sermons. I just paint cardboard, all right? So here's the thing is like Zacchaeus, I'm sure we're going to see as we dive into this story that Zacchaeus probably came to this realization that he didn't measure up because he was short. And so he was going to do whatever it took to climb the highest tree in his life. And he was going to sacrifice everything. And when I'm talking about a tree, I'm talking about a career or whatever that tree represents in our life. He's going to climb as high as he can to get to the top. And he sacrificed his family, he sacrificed his friends, and he sacrificed his faith all for his career. And he was hated by everyone because of what he did. He was considered a traitor because he became a tax collector as a Jew working for the Roman government. And so all of his fellow Jews hated him because according to the Roman law, the Roman law would set what you could ask for, but there was freedom to ask for more. And here Zacchaeus was like, you know what? I'm tired of being too short. So I'm going to take whatever I can get out of people. And he constantly was ripping people off and demanding more than what they owed on their taxes. And so I'm sure many times throughout his life, he was, the brunt of all kinds of jokes, being too short and everything else. And so he was going to do whatever it takes to get to the top of the tree. Now, the place that we're going to be talking about, I'm just setting up the background for what we're going to in Luke 19 this morning. The place where Zacchaeus lived was in a city called Jericho. Right? We studied Jericho last year and we studied the book of Joshua, remember? And when Joshua went in, it was like this big issue because Jericho was a well-fortified city that was mounded up. There was all these walls to get around, and then God did the miraculous and brought the walls of Jericho down. But Jericho was one of the oldest cities in the world at this time. It was probably over 6,000 years old, and it was one of the wealthiest cities around. It was very wealthy. And so Zacchaeus, we don't know where he originally lived. My guess is he probably moved to Jericho because you know what? I'm going to get to the top of the tree. I'm going to do whatever it takes. And he not only became a tax collector, but it tells us in this passage, he became the chief tax collector. He was the big dog when it came to all the tax collectors and collecting all the money, and he probably had a really nice spread, really nice house. Jericho was known for its plush gardens, its irrigation system, and so Zacchaeus, he probably had it all. He probably had a 4-car garage with all of his off-road vehicles. He probably had 2 mules and a horse and a donkey or something, but he had all these things. He was incredibly wealthy at the expense of everything else. He had it all, except for he lacked the most significant things in life. He had no relationships with anybody because everybody hated him, and he had no relationship with God because he betrayed his faith for his career in climbing the biggest tree in life. So today we're going to dive into Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 1. It kind of gave you some background behind this wee little man named Zacchaeus. And it says this, it says, Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. So here's Jesus. There's this crowd of people. It's like a parade as he's making his way through town. Verse 2, it says, there was a man there named Zacchaeus, and he was the chief tax collector. Now, we only see this, I think maybe one time in the Gospels, because most of the time you just see a tax collector, but Zacchaeus was the chief. He was the big dog in this very wealthy city, tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich, and that was all at the expense of other people, even his own family. He was going to do whatever it took. He didn't care. Verse 3, he tried to get a look at Jesus. Jesus coming through the crowd. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. Ever been in that situation? Trying to see somebody, and it's like even when you're at church, there's always that, or you go to some concert or something, there's always that 7'5" person that sits in front of you. It's like Murphy's Law. It always happens. A big, tall person's in front of you, and you're trying to see around. Well, Zacchaeus, this guy's just too short to see over the crowd. And you know what everybody else is thinking, right? We're not going to let you up front to see. They're just going to, it's like, we don't like you. We don't like anything about you, so they're not even going to let him see. So Zacchaeus, he's trying to think of how he's going to get there. He says, nothing's going to stop me. I am so tired of coming up short. I am not going to let this stop me from having this one opportunity for this famous person that's coming through town to see him. So it goes on in verse 4, and it says this. So Zacchaeus, he runs ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. We just sang about that, right? So he's like, I'm not going to miss this opportunity. I have all this wealth. I have all this stuff. I'm not going to miss this. So he goes, runs, climbs up this tree so he can see Jesus. Verse 5 comes. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Now, as I was thinking about this week, I'm sitting there thinking, that probably was a kind of a moment of incredibly mixed emotions, right? I mean, you kind of have this thought in your head. It's like, I got to see Jesus. I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'm going to see Jesus. I got all this stuff, in my life. I've worked my way all the way to the top. Now this famous person we've heard about is coming through town. I'm not going to miss it. So he goes and he climbs up in the tree and he gets up there and then he hears his name. Jesus calls him out by name. And I'm sitting there thinking about myself all the times I hear my mom saying, Jimmy, come down out of that tree right now. Right? And so I'm sitting there thinking, ooh, I'm sure in this moment he probably, swallowed deep. Oh, man, he knows my name. And you're sitting there thinking, well, is it because of my reputation? Because he had a really bad reputation. He was hated by everyone. Is it because of my reputation? Why is this? It was a risk for him to climb up in that tree, and all of a sudden there's all these emotional thoughts that are just flooding his mind. It's like, why did he call me out by name? He's probably thinking, I'm in big trouble for the way that I've been living my life. And Jesus does this incredible thing. He just doesn't look at him. Zacchaeus didn't have a big name tag on saying, hey, I'm Zacchaeus, notice me. But Jesus calls out his name. Let me just say this. Let me just kind of put a bullet point up here. I think this is kind of a key part that Luke brings out in this story, that Jesus knows everything about you. Everything about you. Matter of fact, when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Luke even records this in earlier chapters. When you look at the Sermon on the Mount, one of Jesus' most famous sermons that was recorded by several of the gospel writers, one of the things that Jesus even tells the people, it's like, you guys are so worried about life. You're trying to climb every tree there is to try to get to the top and do all these things because you think, if I just don't climb to the top of the tree, I'm not going to have everything that I'm going to need. And God, Jesus looks at them and says, look, don't worry about all these things. Matter of fact, this is what it tells us in Luke chapter 12, verse 7. Jesus tells the crowd earlier on, he says, the very hairs on your head are all numbered. Now, God doesn't have to count as much as he used to, except there are more coming out in other places that we don't want them, right? But Jesus says, look, every hair on your head is numbered. That's how much God knows about you. Matter of fact, I'm sure Zacchaeus understood this growing up Jewish. Because a psalm you've heard me talk a lot about in Psalm 139, this was a very famous psalm of David, Psalm 139, starting in verse 1, putting it up here on the screen. It starts out and says, oh Lord, David says, you, Lord, know everything about me. Everything about me. And he goes on and explains this in this psalm. He says, you know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. So he's sitting there thinking, even when I'm away from the temple where God's presence resides, you know everything about me. You know what I'm doing. You know where I am. You know what I'm saying. Goes on in verse 3. He says, you see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. This is what we call the omniscience of God. He knows everything. He knows everything about us. He's the author of our life. We are here because of him. And Zacchaeus understood this, but Zacchaeus took this risk because he wasn't going to miss seeing Jesus. So he runs ahead up the road, kind of predicts the direction Jesus is going to go. He climbs up in this tree, and then he gets up there, and in this moment, he hears Jesus say, Zacchaeus, calls him out by name. Now, let me ask you this. How many of you have ever been in a crowd and somebody called you out by name? Right? Now, what happens a lot is when we have kids, or somebody, you're trying to get a hold, trying to get your parents' attention, you say, we always make this mistake, we say, Mom, right? We say, Mom. Well, how many moms are typically in the crowd, right? Or Dad, right? We say, Dad, and everybody's turning around looking like a bunch of cattle, right? They all turn and look. You know what I'm talking about, those of you who live out in the country, right? They all turn, it's like, well, there's a whole bunch of moms and dads. But then when they're trying to get your attention, what do? You call your parents' name. You call them out by name. Well, have you ever been called by name by a famous person in a crowd of people? Ever had that happen? So years ago, when I was in college, my first semester on campus down at IU, I went there to study jazz. Some of you heard my story. I'm a trombone player. I went there to study jazz trombone. And the guy who was the head of the jazz department, matter of fact, I got a picture of him here, put him up on the screen. Hope it's there. There's no picture? No picture. All right, we'll get the picture. Anyway, so there's a guy, famous jazz trombone player, black guy named by the name of David Baker. He passed away several years ago, but David Baker was a phenomenal jazz trombone player, and he was in a serious car accident years ago, and he had to stop playing, but he learned. He was a composer. He started playing keyboard, and he started playing the cello, which was the same notes trombone play. Because of that accident, his jaw was messed up. But I took a jazz improv class with David Baker, and it was my freshman year, and it was a really difficult class. I actually should have never signed up for it. It was a 300-level class. I don't know how they let me in the class. It was way over my head, and I was stressing out the whole time. So fast forward the clock. After I graduate, 5.5 years later, after changing my major to audio technology, I get a job. I'm working at the TV station for several years, and we have a program where we're bringing in some professors. All right, and one of the professors was David Baker. Now, have in mind, I haven't seen him since my freshman year. It had probably been 8 years since I've seen him in person, and he comes in the studio, and there's a whole bunch of other people that are there in the studio, our producer and some others there, and I'm the audio engineer. I've got to put the mics on all the talent, and as he's coming in the studio, he catches he sees me, and he says, "Hey, Jim, how you doing?" And I'm like, whoa. He remembered my name. I must have been that bad of a student. He remembered my name, but for me, as a trombone player, it's like, here's one of the most famous jazz musicians in the world. And he was once a famous jazz trombone player, that he remembered my name, and he called me out by name. And it just does something for you when you hear somebody famous call out your name, right? It's like, man, I am somebody. I didn't think I was anybody. It's like, now I am somebody. And then it's like, oh, is that good or bad? Right? What does he really remember about me? But what does my name represent? Right? So here's this moment, and Jesus says, Zacchaeus. And he's like, oh man, what does he want? Well, then it goes on. All right, let's move on here. He says, Zacchaeus. The rest of this verse goes on. He says, Zacchaeus, he said, quick, come down. Once again, I hear my mom's voice or my dad's voice saying, you come down right now or you're going to get a whooping. All right? You know what I'm talking about? Because you're going to fall. Something worse is going to happen to you if you don't get out of that tree. One of those branches are going to break, or you're going to let, slip, and you're going to fall. And so imagine Zacchaeus in this moment. He's thinking, oh, man, not only did he call me by name, but now he's telling me to come down. Now, here's what's crazy, because the next thing that Jesus says is, that's what I love about these invitations. It's scandalous what Jesus says. This is like, we think about some of the worst things that people do that we don't like, we don't agree with, and they'll push their agendas, and we get really mad and upset about those things to where we like to go on social media and just respond back. We want to. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we do. And this is kind of this Zacchaeus. He's this guy that nobody likes. Nobody agrees with his agenda. Nobody agrees what he's doing. He is a traitor. He is a notorious sinner, is what the scriptures say. We're going to get here in just a moment. This person that you think, it's like, this person, I do not agree with what they're doing. And Jesus says these scandalous words, and he says this after he calls him by name, tells him to come down. He says, I must be a guest in your home today. Now, those are incredibly powerful words for a guy who has done everything to betray his faith and his friends and his family, all so he could measure up and climb up this tree, this ladder in life to get to the top of the tree so he could have everything, and he didn't care what it cost him to get there. And then here's this moment. He's trying to just see, because he's this wee little guy, he's trying to see Jesus, and Jesus calls him out by name, and then he says, come down, and then he says, because I want to be a guest in your home today. So here's what I want us to understand in this invitation that Jesus gives to Zacchaeus. Is that just next bullet point here is just understanding that you are never too far out of reach for God's love. It doesn't matter what you've done. Doesn't matter what your reputation is. Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks about you. We see over and over again in the Gospels the people that were just the most wicked, sinful people that Jesus goes and he extends this invitation of grace and acceptance towards a person to come to him, letting Jesus do the rest of the work in their life. And so we see here that we're never too far out of reach for God's love, no matter what. And Jesus, this invitation is he invites himself. Now, could you imagine Jesus being here today? And then he would say, hey, I want to come to your house after church today. Right? I mean, what's going through your mind, right? You're sitting there thinking, oh, man, I've got to let Jesus come to my house today. Now, let me put another thing up here on the screen, another question. Oftentimes I think, what will happen if I let Jesus come too close? I mean, here's this moment. I'm sitting there thinking, let's try to put ourselves in Zacchaeus' shoes. He's bad. He's got a bad reputation. He's done a lot of bad things all the way up to this moment. Jesus calls him by name, tells him to get down that tree. He says, look, I'm going to come. I want to come to your house today and be a guest at your house. Now, here's this moment. I don't know about you, but I'm sitting there thinking, man, what happens if I get too close to Jesus? If I let him get too close to me? It might cost me something. What is he going to say to me? If he knows my name, he probably knows everything that I've done. He knows everything about me, right? Years ago, I read this little booklet called My Heart, Christ's Home. Anybody ever read that? It's just a small little booklet. And I read it when I was in college. And it's basically this booklet that just talks about how what Jesus wants access to. It's like if Jesus were here and say, hey, I want to come to your house today. And then immediately we're sitting there thinking, it's like, okay, I didn't make my bed this morning. The kitchen's a mess. I didn't clean up. I got to make sure I run around the house. What if Jesus looks in one of my closets? What do I have laying out on the table? What's on my computer screen? What's on my phone? I mean, what all does he want access to? If he comes walking in my house, what's he going to find? And the whole picture of this little booklet is about not our homes, but the home of our heart. What if I let Jesus get too close? If he knows everything about me, he's going to find everything I've got hidden away in my closet that nobody else in this room sees. He already knows about it. He already sees it. And so many times we're afraid, what if I let Jesus get too close? Because there's things I'm ashamed of. There's things I don't want Jesus to see. And we're also always thinking, man, if he comes in my house today, what is he going to find? What am I hiding? What's going to happen if I let him get too close? But Jesus says, I want you to come down out of your tree, Zacchaeus. I want to be a guest in your home today. And that's the same invitation he has for each one of us. The invitation to come and make himself at home in our hearts, in our lives. And so what I want to go this morning with this is this invitation to come down out of the tree is just really looking at how to come down to Jesus. How do we come down to him and let him come into the home of our heart? And we're just going to look at Zacchaeus' response because it's crazy what takes place in this moment of this wee little guy that was trying everything he could to measure up and just continued to fall short. Even though he had it all, he fell short, and Jesus said to come down. So picking up in verse 6 in Luke chapter 19, it goes on. And Zacchaeus, this is how he responds. It says, Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. He didn't waste any time. He didn't hesitate. When he heard Jesus call his name, I'm sure there was all these things. He probably heard his name said a lot with all kinds of choice words added next to it. Jesus calls him by name, and I'm sitting there thinking about this moment that it wasn't just the fact that Jesus called him by his name, but it was probably the way that Jesus looked into his eyes and the tone that Jesus used when he spoke to him that knew that Jesus had the very thing that he was looking for, the very thing that he was longing for. And, we don't really know, but we're going to see this response of what takes place. So the first thing I want us to look at here is how we come down to Jesus, how we walk away from this tree that we're holding on to so quickly. The first thing, number one, is just simply risk responding quickly to Jesus. This is what Zacchaeus does. He just takes a big risk. It was a risk for him to climb up in the tree. He knew that Jesus would probably see him if he could see Jesus. He knew it was a risk, right? We all take risks in life, right? Some degree or another. We take some kind of risk, right? We've all climbed trees. We've all done these things. But here's this moment where Zacchaeus has to make a decision. What am I going to do? Am I going to stay up here where it's safe, or am I going to come down? And he risked responding quickly to Jesus' invitation to go to his house. He did not hesitate. And we see examples of this in Scripture. I want to go back several hundred years to 1 Kings chapter 18. I think I got this next verse here. Maybe I don't have 1 Kings. All right, let's jump ahead to Luke chapter 19. There it is. Okay, thanks, Bill. So in 1 Kings chapter 18, it tells us this. It says, Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is, then follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. So here's this whole situation back during, in the middle of, near the end of the reign of the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, was this guy Ahab, who's this wicked king. And he was going around killing all the prophets of God because this foreign woman that he married, she worshiped all these false gods. And one of them was Baal, and she had all these prophets of Baal. And Ahab was just this weak leader, and he did whatever she said. And so God sends Elijah. And now he always called Elijah a name. He always called him, you troublemaker, what are you doing here now? Because his mindset was, all you're going to do is come here and cause trouble. And Elijah says, no, we're going to go up to the top of Mount Carmel because we're going to have a big showdown today. We're going to see who the one true God is. We studied this a couple years ago, and we studied about Elijah. And so they get up on top of Mount Carmel, and they set up this altar, and they put this sacrifice. Elijah put this sacrifice. He said, okay, all you prophets of Baal, you pray to your false gods and see if anything happens. And nothing happened. They're out there cutting themselves. They're piercing themselves, doing all kinds of things, trying to appease these idols, and nothing happened. And so Elijah says, stand aside. And he takes water and he starts dumping it on top of all the wood, over the top of the sacrifice. It would be a miracle for that wood to ever ignite. And then he takes a moment and he prays. And God sends fire from heaven and it comes down and consumes the sacrifice. And then Elijah, he asked them this question, how long are you going to hesitate? God is calling you right now. How long are you going to hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, then choose to follow him. And I'm sure that Zacchaeus is thinking about this moment. It's like, I got a decision to make, but I can't hesitate. I got to decide to do this right now. Matter of fact, just a little bit later on in this passage in Luke chapter 19, right after Jesus invites Zacchaeus into his home, he goes on to tell a story about this master that goes away and leaves his servants in charge of all their stuff. And it's all about money, which one of the Gospels calls it the parable of the talents. This is the parable of the servants in Luke's Gospel. And he says, hey, he gave them all something they were responsible to invest, but one guy didn't do anything with what he was given. He had an opportunity to make a decision, and he hesitated. And I love the way the Message, paraphrase translation, puts it, where it says, risk your life and get more than you ever dreamed of. Risking it for God, risking what God has entrusted with you. Risk it and end up with more than you ever dreamed of. But if you play it safe, you're going to end up holding the bag. And you see, for Zacchaeus, he spent his whole life taking risk. I'm going to risk my family. I'm going to risk my faith. I'm going to risk my relatives. I don't care what it takes. I'm going to work my way all the way up to the top. I'm going to invest, and I'm going to invest and invest because I want to become wealthy and I want to have it all. But even when he had it all, he had nothing. because he didn't have Jesus and he didn't have any friends to share all that he had with. Now Jesus is then asking him to take a big risk by letting Jesus come to his house. And he quickly took the risk to respond, to let Jesus come into his life, into his home. And when we study the scriptures, we see that when it comes to the theme of the kingdom of God, it's not trying to measure up to see if I have what it takes and trying to work my way to the top. The whole message of the kingdom is a downward descent. You descend into greatness. You don't ascend into greatness. You descend into greatness. And that's the whole model that our Savior Jesus modeled for us. When he stepped out of eternity, became fully God and fully man, born, we celebrated Christmas not that long ago, born through the Virgin Mary, humbling himself, and then growing up and even going down farther, humbling himself to the point of death on a cross. But as we know, Easter Sunday's coming. The grave could not contain the Lord of all creation, and he rose from the grave. But the model that Jesus gives us is a downward descent. And Zacchaeus, this wee little man, was doing everything he can, striving in life to work his way to the top. And now Jesus says, you need to come down. You need to come down and let me in. And so he risked by responding quickly to the invitation. Now here's what happens to many of us when we take that first step of faith. And we're going to decide that we're going to live our life for Jesus and come down out of our tree. Notice what happens here in verse 7. And Luke clearly makes a point of putting this in this story. It says this, but the people were displeased. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. They're grumbling over Jesus' decision to invite Zacchaeus. This is a guy that none of you in this room would like, not even me, right? There's all these people in life. It's like, there's no way. This guy is just a traitor. He has done so many wrong. He's hurt. He's put families in trouble financially because he's taken advantage of them. That guy deserves to be persecuted. He deserves death. He doesn't deserve Jesus inviting him to his house. So they grumbled, right? Sometimes I think grumbling is a spiritual gift. Because God's people do it a lot, right? We go all the way back to Exodus. They grumbled all the time. It didn't matter what Moses did. All the miracles God did, they still grumbled. Grumble, grumble, grumble. And you know the reason why I think we grumble? I think we sit there and we grumble because we saw someone else take the risk and got what they longed for from Jesus where we wouldn't do it. And we start grumbling because we want what they got, but we weren't willing to take the risk to do it. And so it's easy sometimes to grumble. Why did they get to do that? Why did they get that position? Why did they get that? Why doesn't God do that for me? Right? They took the risk. Zacchaeus took the risk. And I think it's easy to grumble. And I think we got to be careful. I think there's some good stuff we can learn for this. Because sometimes in our grumbling, we can keep people out of the kingdom. Right? Because we're not living the life that Christ called us to. He invited himself to this notorious sinner's house. And it's easy for us to be on the wrong side sometimes in history of the issues that are going on because we like to grumble about them rather than inviting the lost and the broken and the hurting into our lives like Jesus did. And so there's all these grumblers, and I'm sure that Zacchaeus in this moment is like, goodness, I don't deserve this at all, but Jesus is inviting himself to my house. He wants to come to my home. All these people are grumbling, but this is how Zacchaeus responds in verse 8. It says, meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord. I love the way he phrases that. He stood before the Lord, right? Every one of us someday are going to stand before the Lord and give an account for what we've done. And this is what's going on in Zacchaeus in this moment. He took the risk. He came down out of the tree. Now he's standing before the Lord. And he said, here's the deal, Jesus. I will give half my wealth to the poor. That's a huge change. That's a huge change of heart. Look, I've been ripping all these people off. I've been doing all this. I will give half my wealth to the poor. It is evident that Zacchaeus has totally changed the direction of his life. He had been trying to measure up. He says, you know what? I don't care about this anymore. Forget all that. I'm not trying to ascend anymore. I'm going to descend. And I'm going to give it all up for the sake of my God and for the sake of Jesus. So he said, I'll give half my wealth. Which brings you to the second thing, number 2. Not only do we risk the responding quickly, but we need to release the things that are holding us back. What's holding you back from taking the risk to be all in and following Jesus? There's always something for every one of us. What's really holding you back? That we just want to cling so tightly to the things that are in our life. But I like doing this, or I like doing that, or I just like just the comfort that I have, whatever it is. What is the thing that's holding you back? Because what Zacchaeus does is he releases the very thing that's holding him back. He'd been trying to measure up and work his way up. So I'll just put this here up on the screens. What is keeping you from letting Jesus have full access to your life? That's what he's asking for. That's his invitation to come down out of the tree. What's keeping us from letting Jesus have full access to every part of our life? And there's a number of different things. For Zacchaeus, we'll put this list up here on the screens. There was pride. I mean, he was just arrogant and prideful because he didn't measure up, and he wasn't going to let that little, pigtail Patty keep him from getting where he wanted to go. He was going to figure out a way to get on the ride, the biggest and tallest ride. And so his pride and money had a hold on him. It's not that you can't have money. It's that many times those things have us, right? And I don't want to let go of anything. I want to have what I have. Or maybe it's our past hurts, something that somebody did. It's like there's no way I'm going to trust Jesus with that part of my life, because if I do, I'm going to get hurt. I'm telling you, Zacchaeus had a lot of hurts. He got called a lot of names over a period of time, probably most of his life, because of the things that he chose to do. And fear. Fear is another thing. We can add a number and list different things here. Fear is another thing. I'm just afraid if I let go and really trust Jesus with my life, what's going to happen? And so Zacchaeus, he responds. He said, I'm going to give away half. And then it goes on. The next part of this verse, he says this. He said, Lord, here's the deal. If I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. I think we should all post this on social media for our government to see. I mean, it'd be crazy if the government said, hey guys, you know what, we've been cheating you guys all these years. We're going to give you 4 times back, right? That would never happen. But here's this guy's been ripping people off. He said, I'm going to give, all this to the poor. And not only am I going to do that, I'm going to take it one step farther. I'm going to give back, pay back 4 times as much. Just give it to me in gas, right? I'm gonna do this, And so Zacchaeus, here's the third thing and last thing. The third thing is this. Here's what Jesus was after that Zacchaeus walks into, is to reconcile with the people you have wronged. This is this life that Jesus calls us into. This is part of this downward descent, that we have to humble ourselves in the midst of the things that we've done wrong and be reconciled. We take the risk of quickly responding, but then we release these things that are holding us back. But then what Jesus is after is that he's after us reconciling. Now here's what's so crazy and powerful in this story. Jesus never called Zacchaeus out on anything. Just being in his presence and seeing the look in his eye changed his life. No one has ever spoke to me this way. Nobody's ever called my name that way before. Nobody's ever wanted to come to my house. This was a life-changing moment for Zacchaeus. And in this moment, he realizes as Jesus is there that he needs to make things right. And he needs to reconcile with the people that he has wronged. Now, here's the challenge with that. It's not going to be easy. Especially when you've lived a life the way Zacchaeus has lived his life. This invitation that Jesus gives him to get everything right in his life, it's like, that is not going to be easy. You've totally put a family at risk because you've ripped them off, taken money from them, and now to think that I'm going to go back to that family and give them 4 times back, could you imagine how difficult that would be to do that? What the people are going to think, you're going to show up at their house like, what do you want now? You want more money? No. It would just be really hard to have that conversation, and it would be really painful to initiate the conversation. But this is what the Scriptures calls us to. Matter of fact, the Apostle Paul, let me give you this verse here, one of my favorite verses from Acts 24. Paul says this, the Apostle Paul, who was once a persecutor of the church as an unbeliever, and then has this radical conversion, he says these words. He says, so I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. In other words, he's saying, I'm going to do whatever it takes, no matter how much it hurts me, to be right with God and to be right with people. No matter what it takes, I'm going to do the hard work. Even if it hurts, I'm going to take that step to make things right for the people that I have wronged. Now, it doesn't mean that all those relationships are going to be reconciled. That's the goal. That's what Jesus did for us. He came so that we could be reconciled back to the Father, right? He sacrificed. He paid his life on the cross. He went through incredible pain so that we could go free, right? This is the model that our Savior gives us. This is the picture of the gospel. And Zacchaeus clearly understands the gospel, that he needs to make things right with those other people. And so many times as I've talked with Christians over the years, because I sit there and I think, if there's anything that the church of Jesus Christ should be known for, it's reconciliation and forgiveness in our relationships. And it is probably one of the things in some 30 years I've been in ministry that we are the worst at in the world. And the church should be the best at it. But we struggle with it because it's hard and it's painful. And so when I'm telling people, it's like, look, you need to go and make this right. Well, you don't understand what they did to me. No, I don't. But I know what other people have done to me, and I know what I've done to other people. And Jesus didn't come pointing the finger and say, look, I know what you did. He poured out his life, and he modeled repentance, humility, repentance, and forgiveness, right? We talked about that, which works towards reconciliation. And so oftentimes people say, well, where do I start? How do I start? Let me just put this up on the screens. Here's where you start. You start by telling your story of how Jesus changed your heart. That's where you start. And you go back and you say, when I was a kid and I was growing up, I went to the amusement park and I realized that I didn't measure up. And I went back a second time and I realized I didn't measure up. I went in for this job interview and I didn't get it and I realized I didn't measure up. Somebody did something, somebody said something. I got so tired of fighting, being too short and not making it up, not measuring up, that I was going to do whatever it takes. And so I did all these things and said all these things so that I could measure up and I could get to the top of my tree. And then Jesus called me by name. He said, look, I know what you're struggling with. You need to come down. You need to come down now and just let it go. Release it and trust me with it. And in this moment, Jesus came into my life and changed my life so that I don't have to look at this and be worrying about that thought anymore. Jesus climbed the tree in my place. And he poured out his life on the tree for me. And so I'm here today because I want to give back 4 times of what I've ripped you off from. That's what Jesus invites us into. This is the life that he calls us to. We start by telling our story, how Jesus changed us. And so Jesus then responds. It's clear in this moment, Zacchaeus understood what Jesus was after. And in verse 9, it says this. Jesus responded, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. It was by his actions, by his response, not by his words, but by his actions. He had the fruit of repentance. He is a changed life. And Jesus says salvation has come here. Because here's the key. Luke chapter 19, the last verse here, verse 10 says this. It says, for the Son of Man, this is the whole reason Jesus came. The Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. He's invited us in. And he calls us to invite the broken, the hurting, all those with all their agendas, all their mess in as well. And he wants us to partner with him in the invitation of the kingdom. Amen.